Clate, how, you have been traveling in this being-centered life for about, what, 13 years?
Yes, that's right.
And when was the first time you woke up to this fact that there is something called a being-centered life? And how did it happen?
Yeah. Well, I started working with Steve Hardison, and that was about 13 years ago. And it wasn't long before I started to recognize what it meant to be living a being centered life, even though we didn't call it that back then. It was, Steve would always help me see how I was showing up in the world, how I was, what the place I was coming from, as he would describe it. Um, and it started to become a very common way of discussion for me and Steve to talk about different things that were happening in my life and relate it back to who I was being. And so, of course, when you work with Steve, one of the first things is you begin creating your I am statements. You begin to get clear for yourself on who you are for the world. And so it was probably within just, a few weeks of working with Steve that I began to really practice being, who I intended to be for the world.
Clate, how did you find when you started working on how you show up, where you come from? And
Yeah.
then with this understanding, when you go back to your business, when you think in terms of money, when you think in terms of wealth, when you think in terms of people management, how did that transition go, or what was your experience like?
Yeah. Um, you know, it I guess I'm a slow learner because it took a while. And I would say I'm still doing it. I'm still
Hmm.
working on who I'm being every day. But I think that what happened was I began to recognize what it is to be my word. And I began to really recognize um, where the place that I'm coming from as I interact with people. And so then it became very natural in my interactions with my team members at work and with all of our employees to intentionally show up a certain way. And like I said, I'm still working on that every day. I don't feel like I've arrived at that. I'm trying to be my best self and be who I feel like the world needs me to be and who I want to be. I'm working on that every day. So what I would say is that as I worked on the principles with Steve, and then I began to live those principles in my work life, it was just practice to be around people, and with each interaction is an opportunity to ref- afterward to reflect and say, okay, how was I showing up in that interaction? And especially if it didn't go well, to then say, okay, well, what was I bringing? What were my thoughts, and where was I coming from in that conversation that resulted in a less desirable outcome than I would have wanted?
Clint, okay, so I would want to ask you, how was your experience? How did you see any change in how business world perceived you when you started making these changes in who you're being? I mean, your employees listening to you and your growing number of employees, and then how would you train them? How would you make them understand? It's very rare that even CEOs or business leaders talk about transformation or coming from a being centered leadership. So it's like, people want to have business coaches, people want to have some other coaches, but if as a leader you are being coached by someone like Steve Hardison, and then you go back to your business, then you have your collaborations with other business leaders. How was this all shifting around you when you started
Yeah,
showing up in this way?
yeah, that's a really great point. As I started to operate a little differently, my team members noticed it, and a couple of my team members wanted to learn more and understand it better, and so they began coaching with Steve. And and then there were a couple of others who coached, who kind of, they were seeing it as well, and they wanted to do some coaching as well. So I think the first thing was, when you show up in the world and in a declarative way and a very intentional way, people who are close to you, they notice it, and they start to ask questions about, well, what's he doing? Why is, what's what's he eating for breakfast? I want to eat that too. So I had team members who noticed it and wanted to participate in coaching, and they did. And so I'd say that's one thing. The other thing, though, I would say was, our our business results became much more forward looking. So a lot of times in business, the natural tendency is to look back and say, well, we did A, B, and C, and that naturally leads to D, so we're going to do D now. And in particular, in terms of goals and accomplishments, we did this 2 years ago and this last year, so this year we can do this. And what I found was, as I worked on who I was being for the world, it opened up more space for my team to think in a forward way about growth and about what we are creating. And it put people into a more creative space. And I think that is probably the most powerful part of the business impact of being centered leadership. If you look at, in terms of the business results, if you're just looking at business results, and I don't think of being centered leadership as just business results, but if you are sitting there as a CFO or a financial number cruncher and you're saying, why should we invest in this being centered leadership? Well, you need to say, well, what's the ROI? Well, the return on investment is that a company, a business, will create something in the future that's not tethered by the past. That's not tied to what did we do in the past, therefore this is what we can now do in the future. Instead, we're looking at who we're being in the world and what's possible. And as Steve calls it, we live in the generative world instead of the declarative world. So you can say, you can declare what was, or you can generate what will be. And we want to be generating something very different than just sort of articulating the past.